The UN's highest court has ruled that climate change is an urgent and existential threat. The ruling came in response to a case brought by the island state of Vanu-atu. The court added that failing to protect the planet from the effects of climate change could be a violation of international law.
The court concludes that the duty of states to prevent significant environmental harm applies in the context of climate change, and that this duty forms part of the most directly relevant applicable law. Concerning the duty to cooperate, the court recalls that it lies at the core of the Charter of the United Nations and has been spelled out in the Foundational Declaration on Friendly Relations.
Our correspondent Lucia Schulten is at the court in The Hague. Lucia, what more can you tell us about the court's ruling?
Yeah, so today's ruling is really considered to be a landmark ruling. So first of all, and maybe most importantly, the court did state that there are certain rules when it comes to climate protections as they are stated in the Climate Convention by the UN or also in the Paris Climate Agreement, which are legally binding. These rules are, for example, that states have to mitigate the effects of emissions, or also that they do have to meet the targets which are set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. These are legally binding obligations and are not just for states to follow or not. This is the first thing. The second thing, and maybe when it comes to the consequences even more importantly, a state can be held accountable for breaching these obligations under the normal state liability. That means if it does do a wrongful act by breaching one of the obligations which it has, it could be held accountable by paying reparations if there is a causal link between an action it does and the damage which is caused. This link needs to be proven, but nevertheless it did open the door to reparations under the climate rules that the court did talked about more in detail about, and this will also be studied by a lot of lawyers now what this actually means, but this is the gist of what happened here today.
Did this ruling meet the expectations of the country that brought the challenge, Vanu-atu?
Yes, so this was brought here by Vanu-atu, but behind this was also a group of students that started rallying for this 6 years ago. And we have just heard from Vanu-atu and also from one of the students. They were saying that it did meet their expectations. They called this also a landmark ruling. They seemed very happy with the results. And I think it's fair to say also one of the students was speaking out saying that this is a lifeline for young people. So I think it's very fair to say that they have achieved their goal and that they were satisfied with the result today.
In practical terms, what does this mean for the world's biggest polluters?
So that is a bit the thing, because we have an opinion here, which means that it's not really that the court said, well, country X, Y, Z, you're not allowed to do this or that anymore. But it does mean that there is now an authoritative, like a way of an interpretation out there by the world's highest court, which other states could use to come here to the court and sue a court where they think they're in breach of their legal obligations. But it does also mean that basically everybody that wants to fight a climate case could, take this and use it as an argument in another dispute that he might have in front of a court. So, and this is also what has widely been expected here by the activists that were behind it, that they were saying, well, this can be used as legal argumentation, but they also expect this to be used when it comes to, COPs, when people go for these big climate conferences and so far, and that then somebody would just say, but you know what, we have this paper here and it does say this is a legal obligation, so we are not here to back. This is actually something you have to do.
Mm-hmm. So this can be used as precedent. Are there other countries already waiting in the wings? Does this case end here, or are we expecting a ripple effect around the globe?
So the consequences of who's going to use it and where this is going to be used, this will really this needs to be seen, and people will see how they use it in a legal way. The case itself is over. But what will happen, and we have heard this already from the climate change minister of Vanu-atu, they will bring this back to the United General Assembly and follow up on this and ask for a resolution, and they will keep on campaigning for what they call climate justice and make their case whenever they can. So the case itself is settled, but this might just be the beginning of more and more cases which will base itself on this new legal advisory opinion by the World Court.
That was Lucia Schulten at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Thanks so much, Lucia.
And let's try and dissect this now with Louise Osborne, our chief climate reporter. Louise, first of all, we've just seen the judge there. He's still reading as we speak. But what is so important about this decision?
I mean, this decision really outlines states' obligations to combat climate change outside also the treaties that we have in place. So there is the Paris Agreement, which to some point gives some guidance on what countries should or should not be doing to battle climate change. But what wasn't clear until now is what international laws also apply to state in relation to climate change. So international laws, for example, like human rights, laws, also customary international laws, laws of the sea, that kind of thing. And so two questions were put to the court. One was on the obligations of states to protect climate and environment for states and for, present and future generations, and what the consequences might be for countries that did not follow through on those obligations. And that is what we're still learning. We're 2 hours into the reading so far and not quite there yet.
Okay, quite a long time. But you said that this is not binding. So why should any nation care?
I mean, it isn't binding in that there is going to be anything concrete that countries are going to have to do, but it does give them an idea of how they can move forward and what laws will actually apply to them when it comes to climate change. That will be important, for example, in the climate negotiations, which are coming up again soon in November in Belém in Brazil. And it will give countries like the Pacific Islands, like Vanu-atu, for example, that has brought this case to the court, and also other countries suffering as a result of climate change impacts, a basis from which they can negotiate so that, countries can't just roll over to them and say, okay, we need to renegotiate this particular point. This law is already set in stone, and this is the basis from which they can then move upwards, hopefully more quickly.
To be more concrete, if I remember correctly, recently there was a German company that was taken to court, an energy company, by activists from, I think, somewhere in Latin America. Peru in this particular case. Farmers, I believe, had sued them. And that has been rejected by the court, that claim. Will that change in the future on the basis of this?
That particular claim was rejected on that specific case. So, for example, with this one, it was particularly to do with a lake that was being filled with glacier water, and the court could not say to what extent this particular person's home would be impacted by that, and that's why they rejected that particular case. But this decision that is now still being read out could form the basis for other cases going forward. There are around 2,000 climate legislation cases being heard all around the world at the moment. And we've already seen examples where, for example, human rights has been used on a climate case. There was the European Court of Human Rights case last year, for example, where a group of Swiss women were able to argue that their human rights were being violated by the inaction of the Swiss government. And we could see more of these kinds of cases on the basis of what judges are currently saying at the moment. They have already said during this reading, for example, that human rights law does apply when it comes to climate change, and that people have a right to a healthy environment because that is the basis for all human rights anyway.
Now, if I get you correctly, this is non-binding, and yet it's a big step forward for the climate activists, if you will.
It is a huge step forward, and this is something that people have been fighting for the past few years. This case was brought by Pacific Island students originally who lobbied for governments to take this case to the International Court of Justice and to ask them for a clarification on the law so that, high emitting countries, for example, would be told what their obligations are in no uncertain terms. Whether that is binding or not, it still has an impact.
Thank you very much, Louise Osborne, our Chief Climate Reporter.